say that I am Karen Tronsgard Scott, and I use she, they pronouns, and I work at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and my role there is as its executive director. All right, I see folks loading into the chat. This is great. Let's get started with our panel. I am so happy to be able to introduce these three panelists to you. Dear friends of the network, co-workers, colleagues, and esteemed community members. So tonight we have with us Renetta Liberty. Renetta is a registered nurse. She works at the University of Vermont Medical Center, and she is the coordinator of the statewide sexual assault nurse examiner program. Remarkable expert. And so I'm just going to go ahead and I'll just say the names of all three panelists, and then I'm going to ask each one of you to introduce yourselves in depth. Our next panelist is Kelsey Rice. Kelsey is coming from the Brattleboro area, and she is a survivor who has so much to share and so much wisdom about, just so much wisdom about her experience and how things work in our state. And then our final panelist is Becky Gagne. And Becky is the executive director at the Clarina Howard Nichols Center, which serves Lamoille County. Such a wonderful, energetic, amazing person. Just, you know, I have deep love for Becky. She knows that. So these three panelists are here to share with you. And so what I want to ask you to do, panelists, is to talk a little bit about your role and then talk broadly about the impact that COVID has had on your work. And as you know, you'll have about 2.5 minutes each. So Renetta, would you like to start?
Yes, absolutely. So as Karen said, my name is Renetta Liberty. I've been a nurse for over 30 years, and 22 of those years have been in the emergency department here in Vermont. My other hat is the forensic nurse coordinator, and also a forensic nurse in the emergency department. I'm the Vermont Forensic Nursing Coordinator. And how has COVID impacted my work? Well, I think obviously you can imagine that COVID has presented many challenges to my work as a nurse in the emergency department, as well as the work that I do as a forensic nurse. In the early months of the pandemic, patients were not presenting to the emergency department, but we knew that patients were still experiencing sexual harm. For example, in February of 2020, our forensic nursing program at University of Vermont Medical Center saw 32 patients who had experienced sexual harm. That next month, March, which was the beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, we saw only 5 patients. We became worried that individuals were stuck in homes with violent perpetrators, from children all to the elderly. We were worried about the increase in exploitation of youth who did not have a safe place to stay. One of the first patients that I saw during this time, during the early months of the pandemic, was a young female who presented to the emergency department for a sexual assault exam. She was alone because we weren't allowing visitors at that time. And upon completion of the exam, evidence collection, and injury photography, I asked her about her safety plan. And she shrugged and said, "I don't have a safety plan," because she has to allow the perpetrator in her home, or he would threaten her life or her family. I asked about calling law enforcement, and she said the last time that she called law enforcement, when he was released, he came to her apartment, beat her up, and threatened her family and threatened her with a gun. She didn't want to go to a shelter because she had a home. She had what should be a safe place. She couldn't stay with her family due to COVID-19, and her only way out of the house was work. I highlight this story because I think many of us take safety for granted. We go home to a safe home and a loving family, but many Vermonters do not have that privilege. And those are the Vermonters that were most affected and are most affected by COVID. The families that are staying in hotels with known perpetrators, or victims of intimate partner violence that are living with their abuser and they have no way out of the home, or the child who is being exploited or abused and no one is aware because they're not going to school or daycare. My hope with this is that you all recognize that it's all of our responsibility as Vermonter and as human beings to use our position as well as our privilege to provide safety measures for all Vermonters who are not safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renetta. Kelsey, why don't you go next? What's the COVID been like? What's your role, and has COVID impacted you?
Yeah, so I think I have two answers to that question. So I'm a survivor. I have an active RFA that's been extended till 2025. My abuser is currently incarcerated for multiple violations of the RFA while under supervision for domestic assault with my child in my arms and my other two children in the other room, along with interference with access to emergency services. So again, it's, repeated violations of the relief from abuse order. So, two answers to the question, how has COVID affected me? I come from a place of privilege of that I'm a single mother of 3 children, and in COVID, I was able to maintain employment. I provide child and family support services in Brattleboro through Easter Seals. So I'm home as a survivor with 3 children working remotely, serving families that are also impacted by abuse. And so highlighted for me on a daily basis just how privileged I am, trying to connect people with access to internet to be, have their lives go on. But for me, what that meant is, I was homeschooling 2 children with a toddler, trying to work full time to support my family, while also navigating, again, trying to renew my RFA. My abuser was supposed to serve 7 weekends in jail right before COVID hit, and he didn't have to go in because of COVID. Well, he took off, he left the state, and no one knew about it till I went to renew my RFA. They extradited him back, and we go on. So that's a minor, having to navigate the stress of the legal system, which I'm quite experienced with at this point as a survivor, because that is an ongoing process. But financially, again, quite often I've been left with so much debt fraudulently incurred in my name, that I, just have to pay off, that he left me with. He claimed my child, we share a child, on his tax return last year, despite having no contact with him for years, which, as a single mother, that was a large sum of money I was expecting and hoping for during COVID. But not only did he claim that, but he received all COVID relief for my child because they linked it to, the tax. So of course I went on to amend it, but we all know what happened with filing taxes last year. So, for me, that's huge. But again, I want to highlight my privilege. I worked for a fantastic agency that supported me through all this as a single mother. But it continues to be difficult. We're supposed to work from home as much as possible. That means driving my kids to school in Brattleboro and then driving back to where I live. I drive quite often 2 hours a day just in order to do my job remotely when I need to. So, that's sort of financial piece now. But thinking about when I finally was ready to leave the relationship, if having to have gone through that during COVID, I can't even fathom it. But then I think about, well, I couldn't really fathom what I actually accomplished leaving in the first place. So, when your life is in danger and you feel anyone around you is in danger, it's amazing what you're capable of. But I did lose my home at one point. My abuser sabotaged absolutely every aspect of my life, and he continues to try despite years of separation. So I lost my home, I lost my career, I lost family, friends, every aspect of my life, right? But again, I was able to go out and get another job right away. I was able to go find another home without needing to navigate finding subsidized housing. I'm a case manager. I know how to navigate these systems, and I do qualify for a lot of the support as a single mother, and I definitely take advantage of it. I need it. But again, I know how to navigate those systems. And when you are pushing through, you cannot comprehend the psychological and emotional anguish that we go through trying to leave while also having to rebuild your life. It is incomprehensible. And so what I really want to, I guess, sum up little here, more to say, obviously, I always do, is COVID is huge. Thinking about, I can really relate to why people were not leaving and asking for help, because I don't know what that would have looked like, so I've probably been talking for more than 2 minutes, I'm guessing. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Thanks for sharing all of that. Becky, how about you, from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And thank you, Kelsey. I'm always humbled when I hear Kelsey speak and a little bit of a hard time following her. So thank you so much. My name is Becky Gagne. I'm the Executive Director at the Clarina Howard Nichols Center. Thank you for all of you for participating in this advocacy evening. And thank you to our legislators for the countless hours you've spent and the thoughtful consideration of the many issues impacting survivors of domestic and sexual violence during this unprecedented time. The Clarina Howard Nichols Center provides emergency shelter and advocacy services for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, stalking, and human trafficking in Lamoille County. Over the past year, our communities have faced isolation, food insecurity, skyrocketing unemployment rates, a complete upheaval of our education system, and fear for the physical and emotional health of our family, friends, and neighbors. These conditions have created an even more dangerous environment for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. The opportunities for survivors to reach out have been much more limited during the pandemic. In spring 2020, the calls to Clarina's hotline stopped. We worked with our community partners and local media. We hung posters and did whatever we could to ensure that survivors knew that our services were still available. Slowly over the summer, calls picked back up and requests for shelter started to come in again. While calls to our hotline have remained steady and requests for advocacy services have been plentiful, we experienced a decrease in calls for shelter over the winter and into the spring. I can only imagine that survivors are choosing to stay in their homes due to concerns about whether a shelter is a safe environment during a pandemic. We've also heard from survivors that perpetrators have used the pandemic as a control tactic, such as, "I will call DCF if you take our children out of this home during a pandemic." Our advocates have adapted to new ways of providing services, including transitioning to mostly phone and virtual meetings. Providing high-quality court advocacy has been the most challenging given the changes in court practices over the past year. As a business, Clarina has also had to respond to the needs of our employees. As essential workers, our services continued to be available 24/7. For several months, staff worked remotely whenever possible, but were on site at our shelter to bring new guests into shelter, provide for basic needs such as food, and to provide advocacy and support services to our shelter guests outside whenever possible. We increased cleaning protocols and ensured that all staff and shelter guests had necessary PPE, and we have transitioned back to working mostly on site while maintaining all health and safety protocols. Over the past year, Clarina's staff have worked more closely than ever with our community partners, including the Lamoille Area Health and Human Services Response Command Center. LASROC was formed in response to the pandemic and aims to coordinate local efforts to address the pandemic and beyond. These new and strengthened partnerships benefit the survivors we serve now and well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So I have a second question for you. You know, the Vermont Network just released a first ever report on the economic impact of domestic and sexual violence in Vermont. And even I was shocked after all these years of doing this work. Even I was shocked at the numbers. We spend $111 million in Vermont addressing and responding to domestic violence across a series of response systems. That means that every single person who lives in Vermont pays an average of $177 each year. Significant amounts of money are spent on domestic and sexual violence. And so my question for you is, I'd love it if you could talk specifically about the economic impact of domestic and sexual violence and how that has been exacerbated through the pandemic. Just speak from your perspective. So I'll start with Renetta again. We'll go in the same order. Okay. So go ahead, Renetta.
Yeah. So when I think about the economic impact of sexual violence, I obviously go directly to healthcare costs because that is my experience. And the economic report that you mentioned estimated that the cost of healthcare for survivors of domestic and sexual violence is a staggering $36 million. That's a lot of money. And it's primarily because we're seeing more people and we're providing care for more people. In 2020, we saw a significant increase in patients. In the very beginning, our programs didn't see the numbers that we were receiving previously, but then towards the end of this year and also beginning in this year, The Vermont forensic nurses in all of our hospitals saw almost double the number of patients who were experiencing sexual violence from the previous year, primarily because we expanded our care to include intimate partner violence, but also because we were seeing more people that were seeking care. And while we can put a dollar amount on short-term cost of acute visits of patients coming into the emergency room or wherever and receiving the care, we can really only estimate the long-term health cost of sexual violence. From traumatic brain injury of the survivor who has been repeatedly hit in the head or thrown against a wall or thrown down the stairs, to the chronic mental health complaints of depression, anxiety, and suicide, and not to mention the medical complaints of individuals who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. To provide context, research shows that 94% of women who have been raped experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder during the 2 weeks following the rape. And 33% of women, and I have to repeat that because it just blows my mind every time, 33% of women who have been raped contemplate suicide. 13% of women who are raped attempt suicide. These are the patients that I'm seeing in the emergency room on a daily basis. Our emergency department is filled to capacity with patients who are experiencing mental health crisis, substance misuse, and thoughts of self-harm, many of whom have experienced episodes of sexual violence within their lifetime. And while I don't have statistics on the benefits of forensic nursing care, I anecdotally know that patients who have experienced sexual violence and receive trauma-informed compassionate care from a forensic nurse and an advocate are more likely to have better health outcomes. One of the reasons why I continue to do this work and get up at 3 a.m. when I get called into the emergency department is because I get the pleasure or the privilege, I guess is a better word, of experiencing and witnessing healing. Survivors often come into the emergency department traumatized, and then within 3 hours of care that I am giving with an advocate, I begin to see the healing process. And I have to admit that's very powerful, and it's why I continue to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Renetta, and thank you so much for the work that you do. I really appreciate the way you pointed out that, we tend to look at somebody having been raped as a singular incident, but what we really know is that there's a long arc that follows after the incident. There's a long arc of impact and a long arc of healing, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do at UVMMC and the way that you support other sexual assault nurse examiners in hospitals across our state to be able to offer that healing to survivors. Kelsey, let's turn to you. You talked a little bit about the economic impact of domestic and sexual violence, and I really appreciate the way you raised up the issues of not only what it costs, but what you give up in terms of the economic impact. You talked about just having to accept that that your credit was ruined, and in order to maintain safety, you've just had to accept it and give up on this idea that there will be some sort of fair and equitable consequence or fair and equitable outcome. So from your perspective, what are the economic impacts that impact survivors?
Yeah, I did. There's so many. In my personal situation, I have not ever filed for child support, despite my abuser, when not incarcerated, always maintains employment and makes a fair amount of money. Simply because for me, actually, it feels safer to just cut all ties in my situation. It is that dangerous, really. So keep that in the frame. Haven't even sought child support and still continues to steal from us, right? And yes, you're right, absolutely. Just it's radical acceptance about everything. I mean, it's not just the financial cost and hit and the leaving, but then just sort of what does your life look like going forward? And again, every aspect of your life. And one thing that I think is really important for people, I would love for people to start thinking about more, is that, you know, we can get out and rebuild our life, but it's not like we suddenly go back to life before we met our abuser, right? You literally have to relearn how to enjoy life again, how to just be in your experiences and relate to people in every possible way. Some of us are born with more resiliency and have more resources, and we can kind of fake it till you make it a little better. But that's really what it is. It's not just like, oh, you're out, you're done. It's a lifelong journey. And it certainly is not just a moment of leaving. So, you know, again, an economic impact, you know, it's hard for me. Again, I speak to my privilege because that is a big thing, and it does bother me. And I was pretty upset that it continues to haunt me, even in the present day. But in the scope of things, actually, that's minor for me because of all of the other harms that have been caused to me and my children. But for so many others, that keeps them stuck. How am I going to feed my children? DCF might take my children. We don't have anywhere safe to sleep. I don't have a safe family to go to. I'm you know, have a substance use disorder, and DCF's going to say, well, you're an unfit mother. You know, there's so many pieces. In reality, no one deserves to be kept hostage and terrorized. But I want to be really careful to say the reason why I show up to these things whenever I'm invited or whenever I invite myself is to support not just those that are experiencing the harm, but also those that are causing the harm, to be honest with you. I have zero faith, to be honest, that any sort of restorative justice repair could happen. In my personal situation, there is no repair for the damage that's been caused. But I keep showing up because I have to have faith for his future partners. There will be more. There were women before me, and there will be more. And what we're doing is not working. So thinking about that report for me, I know this isn't your question, but I really wanted to mention it, is that huge amount of money that we're spending in this state. And what we're doing, while our service providers and advocates are doing such important work, and we need to continue funding that work and give more funding, what we're doing in terms of supporting offenders is not working. My abuser is not going to come out rehabilitated. I actually had to attend a hearing a couple weeks ago and heard him speak the first time in years, and there is zero remorse or accountability. And he did go through community accountability programming and community treatment, and now he's had to go through it while incarcerated. It's not working. And so we need to rethink what that looks like. For me, I will continue to lean on the legal system and law enforcement, because that is the only mechanism I have for safety. And I have to think about when he's released from jail and what that risk is for me, because he is a very dangerous, violent person. So I will continue to lean on that system, and I have a lot to say about that system as well. But what we're doing is not working. And you know, those that are causing harm or suffering too, they're not monsters. So that's huge for me in thinking about the amount of money we're spending in this state. Like, if we're going to be spending that much money, let's think about how we can spend it so it's working, right? Yes, and again, I'll wrap it up with, please, you know, recognize my privilege. The fact that I'm able to sit here and speak about my experience speaks to my privilege. And so many of our neighbors are suffering without the supports and resources and resiliency that I have. Yeah.
Oh, Kelsey, thank you so much. You know, you were reminding me that one of the things that stuck out for me in the report was the amount of money that we spend in the criminal legal arena on responding to domestic violence, and there's a stark contrast to what we are not spending on preventing. That, for me, that's just the missing piece, and I really appreciate you raising the issue of how do we interrupt the cycle of abuse for the people who are actually causing the harm. Thank you so much. Becky, how about from your perspective? Yeah, just go. What are the economic impacts?
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm so grateful for this report, and a little shout out to Jessica Barquist, whoever she is on this list here, for leading this effort and many others over the past year, because this was certainly a daunting effort for sure. But I think that this report will really be helpful to us as we continue to advance this work, both in the sort of the intervention work that we're doing, as well as hopefully emphasizing that need for prevention. The report does outline many of the system level costs: law enforcement, healthcare, corrections, victim services, and the judicial system. It also acknowledges that there's so many system level costs that are not quantified in the report, and I can't even imagine what that number would look like if we could have quantified, you know, so many more of the other costs. But in addition to those costs, I just want to outline a few of the direct financial impacts. Kelsey's spoken to some of them, Raynetta mentioned some of them, but when, you know, just included with the survivors we've worked with, loss of employment, you know, as a result of the abuse. So whether that's because a survivor has sustained injury and can't go to work, whether it's harassment at the workplace by the perpetrator, or whether it's just missed work time because of the abuse happening at home. Oftentimes survivors lose their employment. Often survivors lose their housing or have the inability to regain housing because of the abuse that was sustained and the bad, you know, references that then follow them and that sort of thing. Bad credit. Survivors often come to us with little or no credit or bad credit, again, because of the perpetrator's control of the finances and the ruining of that credit. Healthcare. Raynetta talked to that a little bit, but survivors who have no insurance, are underinsured, or have to pay co-pays and deductibles related to the abuse that they suffer. That can be, you know, hundreds and thousands of dollars. Property damage. Perpetrators damage vehicles, homes, clothing, children's toys, anything and everything imaginable as part of their control and abusive tactics. And then just purely no access to finances in general. Perpetrators that control the money, even for survivors who work but have no access to the money that they're bringing in, and no access to paying the bills or ensuring bills are paid or anything like that. And the pandemic has really just made all of this worse, right? Survivors have lost jobs maybe that they wouldn't have lost while maintaining this abuse because businesses closed, kids are now home, schools, you know, maybe kids are home because of childcare or school closures, whatever it might be. So it just an even further loss of income due to the pandemic. We also saw a couple of things very specific to the pandemic as well. The inability of survivors to access their economic impact payments that Kelsey talked about. You know, when a lot of this is based on tax filings and your perpetrator has controlled those finances, then that money is then going to that perpetrator, and it's very rare or can be a pretty prolonged battle, often involving the courts and legal system to try to get access to those funds. You know, we're watching and learning right now about the new child care tax credit that will be available because it faces many of those same barriers and obstacles. And it's heartening. It's good to see that some efforts are being put in place to I think, try to address some of those issues, those filing issues and access issues. But it's just another example of that financial control. And I'll just close by saying on this piece that, you know, there have, I do want to mention, you know, there have been positive economic impacts as well due to COVID. You know, for survivors who actually have had access to those economic impact payments or will get those child care tax credits, you know, that's a lot of money. That can actually be the money that allows someone to flee, to leave, to start new, to start fresh. There've been housing funds that didn't exist before, and all sorts of other resources for survivors who are able to take those steps to be able to access those. And then specifically for Clarina, you know, we received $175,000 in funding from its CARES Act funding through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board to do shelter renovations. And we're able to add a bedroom, we added a bathroom, we added, you know, touchless faucets, hand sanitizers, all of, you know, air circulation units, all amazing features that make our shelter safe during a time of pandemic and for very long into the future, and just a beautiful space as well. So we're thankful for those things. Obviously, you know, we would have preferred, we would have gone without the money if we could have avoided the pandemic, but we're just really grateful for the positives that have come out of all this as well.
That's great, Becky. Thank you so much. So, you know, one of the things that we've explored at the network over the course of the past 3 or 4 years is the idea of if we really center the most marginalized people in our communities in our work and raise them up, learn about what they're experiencing, then all boats will rise. Everything gets better for everybody else. And so the last question we have for the panelists tonight is, you know, from your position, your role, how can we better include and support people who are traditionally marginalized in your area of expertise? And you know, just, you know, in your opinion, what are the current gaps? So we'll just go in the same order. Raynetta, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, I would like to say continue to support the forensic nurses and those who are also providing services and care to survivors. The people that are actually doing the work could always use more support financially, physically, whatever that means. And for my role, I think that I realized, and our program realized that this year, that many people don't feel comfortable going to the emergency department for non-life-threatening injuries after experiencing sexual violence. So I think we need to provide care wherever patients present. Many individuals may want to go to a clinic or to a provider that they know, to an OBGYN office to receive care. So expanding the specialized nursing care to other clinics will provide access to many marginalized individuals who can't or choose not to go to the emergency department for the care. There's another bill that I like to highlight that I think is just amazing, and it's so simple, but it's the menstrual equity bill that will provide free menstrual products to schools and gender-based and gender-neutral bathrooms, and also the nurse's office. And they'll be free to anybody, and they'll be available, so you don't have to go into the nurse's office to ask for that, or you don't have to go into your teacher's drawer to ask for a tampon. And I think this will, as Karen said, lift everybody up, make the rise the boat, or however you said it, and it will benefit all Vermont youths. The other bill that is tied to that would eliminate the tax on menstrual products. I think what's really exciting about this bill is the support of the Vermont youth. In a recent article that I read about youth that were advocating for this, they were quoted as saying that period poverty is real and pervasive, and it affects many Vermonters. The students argued that other products such as garters, which, okay, let's talk about that, girdles, hats, bathing suits, and wedding apparel were exempt from taxes. So I think we can all agree that menstrual products should be a part of that list. Even if you don't menstruate, you can understand that these products are not a luxury, they're a necessity, and they should not be taxed. Another area that I know the legislature is working on, and it's a bill that is very dear to me and the people that I work with, is the firearms relinquishing bill. I think this bill will encourage survivors to report intimate partner violence to law enforcement and potentially file a relief of abuse order if they know that firearms will be removed from the perpetrator's home. Those are areas where I think all of us, and especially those who are you know, living on the margins, could benefit. Thank you.
Thanks, Raynetta. Kelsey, what do you think?
I could speak for hours about the gaps, but to narrow it in, I think broadly, there's a huge gap collectively in terms of just our understanding. And you know, from my experience, while I keep highlighting I'm privileged, I also feel I have experienced what it is to be marginalized as a survivor. It was a new experience for me, you know, coming from my background, and I live it every single day. I've sort of turned it on its head by being willing to be public and speak about it, but I still live it every single day. And this is a walk that I have gone through, seeking safety when I felt my life was in danger. I experienced discrimination from law enforcement. I have experienced just gut-wrenching experiences in the court process. Well, I've had good experiences too. I've experienced discrimination in the workplace as a survivor. I've experienced, again, loss of friends and family, lifelong friends and family, and just sort of social equity and the damage that's caused. And while as in our recovery, we really have to take accountability for choices that we make, ultimately we make those choices when we're experiencing harm. And as a community and as a state, the more we can put in place, more protections and really from abuse orders are so important. And for me, that really it's a matter of life and death for so many of us in that crisis of when we're leaving. I cannot emphasize enough, what I thought the danger risk was with my abuser prior to trying to leave. I had no idea how dangerous he was. And really, I can't even count how many times I tried to end the relationship, but I was so terrified of him when trying to leave. Terrified and also just so overwhelmed by what my life was going to be by trying to rebuild it while experiencing stigma in my community and loss of every aspect of my life, and terrified and seeking, trying to seek help in the way that I was treated in our state. And again, coming from a place of privilege, that's not what I expected. I didn't expect that from my neighbors in my community. And I still, in most cases, I don't think it was intentional, but that is what the experience is. I cannot share that enough. I was shocked coming from a liberal Vermont girl born and raised in Brattleboro. I did not expect that to be what the experience would be. And that's really what's lit my fire, is how I was received by my community. And the way I try to express it when I speak to law enforcement and sharing my experience, it's like crossing enemy lines, right? It's like I'm coming out of a war zone, and I need to be embraced and accepted and supported, because I can't even think about what's going to happen 5 hours from now. And that's not what we receive. We do receive that from our incredible advocates and nurses and, so many wonderful service providers that are skilled and dedicated to this work, but we need that across the board from everyone. So that's huge for me. And yes, relinquishing firearms, it's terrifying. Quite often, even if they don't threaten to kill us or our neighbors or our family, they often threaten suicide. And it's very much that psychological control that, you're already, when you're leaving, I have to tell you, you're so filled with anguish because you still are in that cognitive dissonance of I love him so much, or I love them, right? And I don't want to cause him pain, and his life is going to be destroyed, and I'm ruining everything for him. That's really where you still are. And so then to hear this person that you love so much and you've literally let your whole life be destroyed for, that they're going to kill themselves, it keeps you stuck. So that absolutely has happened to me. I don't think he ever actually had a gun, but he told me he did. He did have knives and threatened to hurt himself in front of me with knives, but he absolutely told me he had a gun. And again, that alone, maybe they'll kill themselves, maybe they won't, but do we want to lose that life? No, we don't want to lose any lives. So, I listen a lot to people speak about their gun rights and we're not looking to take guns away from law-abiding, safe folks, right? We're just looking to save lives and protections. And absolutely, if survivors know that their partner has a gun, that will keep them stuck, because our whole lives are built around staying safe and protecting everyone around us. I think that's what we're doing. We're experts in trying to keep everyone alive. So if we think they have a gun, that we're going to do what it takes to keep everyone alive. So absolutely, that's huge. And again, just whatever we can do, whatever all of the representatives here, any bill that comes through to send the message to supporters, you do not deserve to be harmed, whether you have a substance use disorder or whatever, you may have your own criminal history, you do not deserve to be harmed. And we are going to offer protection and safety. Please, please, please vote in support.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you so much. I just so deeply appreciate your comments. Becky, the economic impact report is really, there's a pie chart in that report that really starkly illustrates the differential costs where we have put money over the years. $63 million of that $111 million per year goes into the criminal legal system. Kelsey was, explicit in saying this is not the only way. We know that for people who live in the margins, that criminal legal system has can have some dire impacts on their lives and also responds differently to them. And then we see that we spend $12 million, 11% money to support victims. And so I wonder if you have anything to say about all of that juxtaposed with services for people who live in the margins.
Sure, absolutely.
Put them in the margins.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the first thing I'll say is, and Karen knows this, that I actually, when the report was released, I actually received an email from a reporter asking for my comments, and specifically asking that, stating what Karen just said, that the report really highlights the amount of money that's going into the criminal legal system, and less funding for either victim services and really non-existent funding for prevention, and asked for my thoughts on that. And my response was, it's not an either or. It can't be. I mean, maybe someday it can be. Would I love to see those corrections costs decreased and judicial costs decreased and law enforcement? Of course I would. I'd love to work myself out of a job and close Clarina someday. That would be the goal. But until we have a lot of money, a lot of resources invested in prevention and adequate resources to even do the job we do today, that's not going to happen. So I would say that. And then in response specifically to the question, this question about marginalized folks, when I first heard this question, I immediately thought about the work ahead of us to ensure that Clarina's services are accessible and relevant to all survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I think of survivors who identify as LGBTQ and specifically those who identify as transgender. I'm heartened to see the widespread support for H128, an act relating to limiting criminal defenses based on victim identity. I want to thank Representative Small and all of the legislators who support this bill. I also think about Black, Indigenous, and people of color survivors of domestic and sexual violence. I don't have a lot of answers, but I have a lot of questions. How can we ensure that our services are accessible to all survivors? What do we need to change about our shelter, our services, our messaging, our outreach? What questions do we need to ask ourselves? How can we engage marginalized survivors in improving our services? How can we evaluate the effectiveness of our services? How can we reflect upon experiences that did not go well and commit to doing better? As one step, Clarina, along with all member organizations of the Vermont Network, is engaged in efforts to center racial equity and justice in our work. We will explore our own personal biases and evaluate our organizational culture and practices. This will lead us to concrete actions to improve the accessibility and relevance of our services for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This country, our state, and our communities can be very scary for marginalized individuals and families. I strive to ensure that Clarina is a safe, respectful, and inclusive environment for all survivors.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you, panelists. I want to encourage everybody to give them some love in using your reaction buttons. I can't thank you enough for talking about your experiences, bringing your expertise and your viewpoints into this conversation. And I noted that many people were taking lots and lots of notes. So I really appreciate the way you've helped to inform our audience. Thank you so much. So we'll pivot now to small groups. And I want to reiterate that you're going to be meeting in your small groups for no more than about 45 minutes. You'll leave directly from the small group, so nobody's monitoring you. You can, have your conversations. Every group will have somebody in the group who will help facilitate the conversation. And we just really appreciate your participation. We want to hear from everybody. We want you to be able to ask your questions and offer your opinions. And so I wish you a really rich and enjoyable time in your small group. And so I'm getting a note from Ann Smith that says they get to, that you get to choose your room. So the idea is that you would go into the room that corresponds with where you're coming from. So I'm sitting here in Heinsberg in Chittenden County. I'm going to choose the Chittenden, Franklin, and Grand Isle room. It'll be very apparent to you once we post the small groups. And if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and ask. All right, are we ready? Panelists, thank you again. So much love for you. So now what we do is we go down to the bottom of our screen. It says join a breakout room. If you click onto that, you'll see a list of breakout rooms. You can join those breakout rooms.
Hey, why am I the person that does not see how to do this?
You see on the bottom, it's along the bottom row, it should say breakout rooms, and there's a little, like a little icon that looks like 4 little squares.
No, I have participants, chat, share screen, record, and reactions. At the bottom of my,
Do you have a more, Becky?
no.
I don't either. I'm the same situation.
Is Anne still with us?
Let me see if I can assign you, Becky.
Okay.
You're able to assign me as well afterwards. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, and it looks like there's a group of folks.